Dr. Li Feng had always been an ordinary man, a middle-aged biologist working in an underfunded lab at a university that barely had enough budget for coffee, let alone cutting-edge research. To the outside world, he was just another face in the crowd, a decent, competent academic who had spent most of his life chasing that elusive prize called personal achievement, without ever really grasping it. But deep down, there was always a gnawing feeling that he was meant for something more. After all, didn't the great men of history push beyond the bounds of the ordinary? Didn't they transcend their limitations? Li Feng had spent years grappling with the limits of human nature. His peers and colleagues, while brilliant in their own right, were content with their safe little niches in the world of academia. They had families, careers, lives that fit snugly within the well-defined parameters of normal society. But Li Feng wanted to become something more than ordinary. He wanted to be extraordinary, if not for the world's admiration, then for his own. It was late one Thursday evening when the idea first came to him, a dangerous, revolutionary, potentially disastrous idea. But it was also his only way out of this monotonous existence. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he typed into his research journal, genetic augmentation through animal DNA. Eagle's vision, cheetah's speed, and strength. He had spent months researching it. Combining the DNA of different species, editing it using CRISPR technology, it wasn't as outlandish as it seemed. Other scientists were working on similar projects, though they were more concerned with curing disease, enhancing intelligence, or extending lifespan. Li Feng, however, wanted more than longevity. He wanted to transform his body into a living vessel of perfection, a being capable of doing more than any human could ever hope to achieve. The strength of an ant, the speed of a cheetah, the vision of an eagle. If he could combine these, he would be the pinnacle of human potential. He would become, quite literally, a Superman, but something gnawed at him, a small voice in the back of his mind telling him this might be a terrible mistake. That little voice had been there ever since he'd started working late into the nights, reading about genetic experiments that had gone horribly wrong. Yet, Li Feng pushed it aside, as he often did when a compelling idea overtook him. What was the point of caution if the prize was greatness? He had everything prepared. The laboratory was stocked with the necessary chemicals, the DNA samples, the sequencers. His body was to be the canvas. And for the first time in years, Li Feng felt a rush of excitement, the kind of excitement that only comes from knowing you're on the edge of something monumental, something that could change everything. He was about to become more than human. He was about to ascend to a higher form. The serum he prepared was a cocktail of genetic material harvested from the eagle, the cheetah, and the ant. He had carefully chosen them for their unique abilities. The eagle's sight, with its ability to spot prey from miles away. The cheetah's unmatched speed, capable of running at over 60 miles per hour. The ant's strength, which allowed it to carry more than 50 times its body weight. Combining these three creatures' traits into his own DNA would give him powers he had only read about in science fiction novels. The problem, though, was that no one had ever tried anything like this before. At least, no one who was still alive to report it. With one final breath, Li Feng injected the serum into his arm. For a moment, nothing happened. He sat there in the sterile lab, waiting, his pulse quickening as he imagined the incredible changes that would unfold within him. Maybe it would take a few minutes, he thought. Maybe a few hours. After all, science was rarely instant. But then, as if on cue, his body jolted, violently, and a wave of heat flooded through him. His head swam with dizziness, his vision blurring, but he fought to stay conscious. He staggered to his feet, gripping the edge of the lab bench as the room around him began to spin. For a few seconds, his body felt as though it were in a blender, every nerve crackling with energy. Suddenly, the sensation of sharp clarity cut through the haze. His vision. It was different. No, not different, it was perfect. It was as though his eyes had been opened to an entirely new world. The minutiae of his surroundings became crystal clear. He could see the dust motes floating in the air, each one drifting lazily toward the floor. He could read the labels on bottles across the room, from 5 feet away. His pupils dilated as if trying to absorb every single detail, every tiny shift in the environment. For a moment, he thought he might be able to count the individual cells in his skin. The euphoria didn't last. Almost immediately, a wave of dizziness swept over him again, and this time it wasn't just his vision that was altering. His entire body felt like it was on fire. He could feel his muscles twitching, his legs restless, as if they were aching to move at a speed that his mind could barely comprehend. It wasn't pain, it was something much worse. It was an overwhelming, primal urge to run. Stay calm, he muttered to himself, but even as he did, his legs began to shift, restless with the need to take off, and then it happened that he sprinted. One moment, he was standing in the center of the lab, and the next, he was slamming into the far wall, his body like a blur of motion, propelled by an animalistic instinct. The impact sent him crashing into the lab's metal shelving unit, which fell over with a crash. Papers, test tubes, glass vials, everything scattered across the floor in a violent mess. He barely registered the disaster he had caused. His body was moving on its own, faster than he could stop it, faster than his human mind could process. His feet seemed to be almost floating, as though they barely touched the ground. "No!" Feng screamed, trying to regain control, but it was too late. His body wanted to run. It needed to run. His mind was losing control of the most basic physical urges, and he couldn't stop it. In a desperate attempt to halt his forward motion, he slammed into the desk, sending it crashing to the ground. The lab was now in complete chaos. The light overhead flickered, casting long shadows across the floor. He stumbled back, his heart pounding as he struggled to regain control, but then something else happened. A strange tingling sensation spread through his arms and legs, as if his muscles were no longer his own. It was as though he had become a vessel for pure, unbridled strength. And just like that, his fingers tightened around the broken desk, and he lifted it, effortlessly, off the floor. His heart raced with fear and exhilaration. The strength of an ant, the speed of a cheetah, the vision of an eagle, they were all inside him now. The problem was, he couldn't control them. For the first time in his life, Feng felt a mixture of awe and terror. Feng stood in the middle of his lab, the chaos around him a reflection of the turmoil inside his body. He could feel his heart hammering in his chest, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The desk still clutched in his hands. He looked down at it, confused. The weight of it was nothing, but his fingers were trembling, straining to unclench. It was as if his body had become something else entirely, something alien, a thing with instincts and desires of its own. He could hear his pulse in his ears, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to sync with his chaotic thoughts. His vision snapped to focus on the smallest details, the lab equipment scattered across the floor, the dust particles hanging in the air, the tiny scuff marks on the concrete walls. It was as if he had just discovered a whole new dimension of existence, a world where even the most insignificant things mattered. But there was no time to marvel at his new sight, because his body was telling him one thing: run. His muscles twitched in anticipation, coiling like springs. His legs vibrated with the urge to take off, to break free of the confines of the room. "Stay calm," he muttered under his breath, but the words sounded weak, distant. His body didn't hear him. The need to move was overwhelming, primal, as if a part of him had been woken up that could no longer be silenced. Without thinking, his legs shifted, pushing forward before he even realized what was happening. In a blur, he sped across the room, his feet barely touching the floor, his body a blur of motion. He slammed into the opposite wall before he could stop himself, the impact knocking the breath out of him. The sound of cracking drywall echoed in his ears, followed by the violent shudder of his body as he tried to halt the madness. But it was no use. It was as if his human consciousness was being overridden by something else. He was still there, still aware of the absurdity of the situation, but his body was moving faster than his mind could process. His muscles were too strong, too fast, too much. The sensation was dizzying, euphoric in a way, like a runner reaching the peak of a sprint, only to realize they had crossed into some territory they were never meant to reach. He wanted to stop, but the more he tried, the worse it got. His hands were trembling, his legs felt like they were about to snap under the strain of holding him back. His mind screamed at him to calm down, but the animal instincts, the eagle's sharp vision, the cheetah's speed, the ant's raw strength, had taken over. The lines between what was human and what was animal were beginning to blur, and it terrified him. He lunged toward the open door, but his movements were too fast, too jerky, and his shoulder collided with the doorframe, sending him staggering back into the middle of the room. His chest heaved with exertion, but even as he struggled to regain control, a small part of his brain marveled at the power he now held. He had never felt more alive, more untouchable. It was like something ancient had awoken inside of him, something beyond the limits of human experience. For a moment, it was silent. His breathing was ragged, and his heart was pounding in his chest. He stood frozen, trying to regain control. The lab was a mess, the floor littered with broken glass and scattered papers. But it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered now was the wildness inside him, the beast he was becoming. With a slow, deliberate movement, Feng forced himself to release the desk he had been holding. He stepped back, steadying himself, eyes still scanning the room with a clarity that bordered on the surreal. Every detail was too clear, too sharp. The overhead light flickered, and he could see every filament in the bulb, every speck of dust drifting beneath it. He could see through the walls, as though his vision could pierce the very fabric of reality. His breath slowed, but his body was still on edge. He clenched his fists, his arms trembling with energy. The strength coursing through his veins was overwhelming, the ant's power surging in every muscle. His bones felt like they were about to snap from the sheer force of it all, but they didn't. His body was no longer just human. He had become a creature of instinct. A loud crack from his left side jerked him out of his reverie. He turned instinctively, his eyes darting to the source of the noise. It was a chair, fallen on the floor, but it didn't matter. The movement had caught his attention, and now his body was reacting, his legs already primed to leap into action. He had to do something. Anything. That he rushed forward, his body moving without thought. In a blur, his hands grasped the chair, and in one fluid motion, he lifted it over his head, feeling the muscles in his back strain with the effort. The weight was nothing. He could have lifted a car with the same ease. But the power that came with it, that was something else. It wasn't human. As he held the chair above him, his breath ragged, he suddenly realized how absurd it all was. The lab was a disaster, his body out of control, and yet, in that moment, he was more powerful than he had ever dreamed possible. But power without control was nothing more than chaos. And Feng was drowning in it. With a growl, he dropped the chair, watching as it hit the floor and splintered into pieces. His body still trembled, the urge to run, to leap, to smash something else growing stronger with every passing second. He needed to do something, but there was no way to focus his mind. Everything was too much. The strength, the speed, the vision, they were all pushing him to act, to be something other than human. He grabbed his head with both hands, his fingers digging into his scalp, trying to control the beast inside him. "Stop," he whispered. "Stop. Control it. Please, control it," but it didn't stop. The more he tried, the harder it became. His heartbeat accelerated, his vision sharpening to a dangerous degree, and his muscles tensed, ready to spring again. He was losing himself, and then, suddenly, his phone rang, the sound sliced through the chaos like a knife. It was almost comical, as if life was playing a cruel joke on him. He turned to look at the phone, still in a daze, but for some reason, the call broke through the fog of his mind. It was a small tether, something that reminded him of his life before all this. He stumbled toward the counter, where his phone sat vibrating, its screen flashing with an incoming call. It was Dr. Zhao, his colleague. Li Feng hesitated. There was no way he could answer this call in his current state. There was no way he could hide what had happened to him. But the phone kept ringing, the sound more insistent, more pressing. He reached for it, his fingers trembling as he swiped the screen. He held the phone to his ear, trying to steady his breathing. "Hello?" he rasped, his voice barely recognizable. His throat felt tight, as if it were being constricted by something far larger than just a lack of control. "Li Feng?" Dr. Zhao's voice came through, tinged with confusion. "Where are you? I tried calling you for an hour. Are you okay? I was worried about you after the experiment." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a faint laugh. "You're not dead, are you?" Li Feng swallowed, his heart still pounding in his chest. His mind raced. How much did Zhao know? Had the experiment gone public? Was he in danger of being found out? I'm fine," Li Feng said, trying to make his voice sound normal. "Just a little under the weather." "You don't sound fine," Zhao said, the concern in his voice growing. "What happened in there? You didn't answer my texts. Is everything okay?" Li Feng's mind was spinning, and the animal instincts coursing through him only made it harder to concentrate. His grip on the phone tightened. "Everything's fine. I'll be in touch later. Don't worry about me." There was a pause. "You sure? I'm coming over." "No, I have some things to work through. I'll contact you later." He hung up the phone abruptly, cutting off the conversation before Zhao could press further. His hands were shaking, and for the first time since the experiment, Li Feng was terrified. Terrified of what he had become, terrified of what might happen next. The transformation was complete, there was no going back. He was no longer just a man. He was something more. Something uncontrollable. As the minutes passed, the urgency in his body started to intensify. The need to run. The need to act. And in that moment, Li Feng realized just how far he had gone. Just how much he had lost. Li Feng stood there for a moment, the phone still pressed against his ear, feeling his pulse spike again. His entire body seemed to thrum with an animal energy, a kind of urgency that was not his own. A barely contained impulse stirred inside him, screaming for release. He had to do something. He had to move. The sensation that had been building ever since the experiment was now so overwhelming that he couldn't keep it under control. It wasn't just his body that was changing, his very mind was warping, reshaping itself into something other. The thoughts inside his head were becoming less and less like thoughts at all, more like impulses, like instincts that didn't belong to him. He gritted his teeth, trying to focus. Trying to hold on to the last shreds of his humanity. But his mind kept spiraling. The eagle's vision made the world feel too sharp, too immediate, and his body felt as though it were powered by a force beyond reason. A force that demanded movement. Action. He glanced at the wreckage of his lab. Broken glass, overturned chairs, toppled equipment. The mess was a testament to how completely out of control he was. There was no order, no structure. Just the chaos of his own transformation. His breath was coming too fast again, too shallow, his chest constricting, and without thinking, he bolted for the door. His legs moved so quickly he was barely aware of them. The air in the hallway seemed to blur around him as he sped toward the exit, faster than any human should have been able to run. The door was locked. He didn't even slow down, just slammed into it with his shoulder, and the wood splintered. The door flew open with a loud crash, and he stumbled out into the cool night air, disoriented but driven by that one unrelenting need. To move. To run. The street in front of him stretched out, a long, empty stretch of asphalt cutting through the quiet suburban neighborhood. It was almost surreal how peaceful everything seemed, how still. How very human. Li Feng felt a cold, sharp sensation wash over him, as though the world around him was a lie. His senses were overloaded with the sharpness of the details, the way the streetlights flickered, the crickets in the grass, the way the shadows shifted in the night. He felt his body, coiled and taut, almost vibrating with energy. His legs were aching to move, to break free. His vision, sharp and crystal clear, picked out every minute detail. He could see the distant movement of a car down the road, the flicker of its headlights reflecting off a distant storefront window. Everything was so clear. So painfully, unnervingly clear. The urge to run was no longer a simple desire, it had become an imperative, a compulsion that was deeper than thought itself. He felt like an animal on the hunt, instinctively aware of the world around him, aware of the distance he could cover, the power that was in him, waiting to be unleashed. With no more thought than it took to breathe, Feng began to run. His legs moved faster than he had ever thought possible, eating up the pavement with a speed that defied reason. His feet barely touched the ground. Each stride carried him farther, faster, until the world around him became a blur of colors and shapes. His body, out of control, out of sync with his human mind, propelled him onward. His heart thundered in his chest, and the wind rushed past his ears, deafening in its intensity. The world blurred and twisted around him, but still, he ran. And in the back of his mind, a single thought echoed, "What have I done?" His body was responding without him, his senses on overload, his mind lost in the overwhelming tide of animal instincts that had been awakened in him. He wanted to stop. He had to stop. But something deep inside him, something animal, told him he couldn't. Not yet. He ran until his legs burned, until his lungs screamed for air. But it wasn't enough. There was always something more, always more speed, more power. He could feel it in his muscles, in his bones. And still, it wasn't enough. At some point, he slowed, his breath ragged, his body aching from the unnatural strain he was putting on it. His vision cleared just enough for him to realize he was standing in the middle of a park, the trees surrounding him swaying in the wind. He had no idea how far he had run, or how long he had been out there. Time felt irrelevant, like a distant memory. He looked down at his hands, clenched tightly into fists, his knuckles white from the pressure. The strength in his body was unnatural, even by his own standards. He had always prided himself on being a man of reason, of control. But this was beyond control. It was raw, untamed. Savage. The power that surged through him now was unlike anything he had ever imagined. And he had no idea how to stop it. His head snapped up at a movement in the corner of his vision, a figure standing by a nearby bench. For a moment, he thought it might be another person, another human. But as his vision sharpened, he realized it was something else entirely. A cat. It was small, but sleek and strong-looking, its eyes glowing eerily in the dim light. It was watching him, its body crouched low, tail twitching. Feng froze. The creature was staring right at him, and suddenly, he felt it, that same wild, untamable urge to chase, to pounce, to hunt. It was instinct. It was his instinct. Without thinking, he lunged forward, his body propelling itself faster than his conscious mind could catch up. The world around him seemed to dissolve, and the only thing that mattered was the cat, the prey. He was close now, so close he could feel the air shifting around him, feel his muscles screaming with the desire to leap. His feet pounded against the grass, his heart racing in his chest, and then he stopped. The cat, sensing the danger, darted away, its lithe body slipping into the shadows before he could get any closer. For a long moment, Feng stood there, breathing heavily, his heart hammering in his chest, his mind spinning. The wildness of his own reaction shocked him. He had almost, given in to the impulse to chase, to hunt. He stood still for a moment, trying to regain control, trying to slow his racing heart. His vision was still too sharp, his body still too charged. He could feel the animal inside him, pushing at the edges of his consciousness. The eagle's sharp eyes, the cheetah's speed, the ant's strength, they were all there, all of them, demanding release, but what did it mean? What had he become? His hands clenched at his sides, fists shaking. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was something else. Something less than human, yet far more than any animal. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Control, he muttered to himself, though he had no idea if he could manage it. I have to control it. But even as he spoke the words, the animal instincts inside him stirred again, louder, more insistent than ever before. Run, they whispered. Run, and never stop. Feng felt the instinct surge once more, but this time, it wasn't just physical. It was mental, emotional. His mind raced with possibilities, each one darker and more dangerous than the last. What was stopping him? What could stop him now? The answer came to him in a rush, a cold realization that washed over him like a wave. Nothing could stop him. Not now. He turned and began to walk, slowly at first, then faster. The night was his now. The world was his to conquer, to control, or to destroy, and for the first time, Feng understood what it truly meant to be free.